They called her just the help, and the town said it like a verdict, the words falling from proud lips with the precision of a judge's gavel. She wore the verdict like a plain apron and a quiet hat, and the wind off the prairie took the sound and scattered it. Dawn found her already at the stove, hands sure from years of stirring kettles and mending things that other folks broke. Dawn found her looking at the window where the sun would creep across the floorboards, warming the dust motes into a slow, luminous speech. She did not speak much. Her silence had weight, the kind that made people suppose there was nothing inside to weigh. They were wrong. She was called Ruth May by the town's ledger, but mostly she answered to Miss May or Girl, and often to nothing at all. She kept the saloon running while the owner, a soft-eyed man named Turner, polished glasses and balanced ledgers. Folks came for drink and gossip and the small, sharp comforts of being right about someone else. They left with fuller bellies and emptier consciences. Ruth wiped the tables, filled the coal stoves, handed out coffee in tin mugs with hands that knew the exact degree of heat a mouth could bear. The cups steamed, a small, open miracle in the dusty room. The saloon had a creak unique to it. Its doors remembered the way people entered and left, and the saloon remembered every uneven step. The bar smelled always of whiskey and lemon oil. The kitchen had its own geography of smells, the rich fat of frying meat, the bitter tang of beans, the sweet leather of pie crust just gone brown. Above the stove, a small shelf held a chipped teacup and a photograph dulled at the edges. A man in a hat, a young woman in a sun-frayed dress, and a child with big eyes that looked out and judged the world already. There was a lock of hair pressed beneath glass and the careful handwriting at the back that read in faded ink. For Ruth, always, L. She had buried L the winter 3 years past. Snow had come when it should not and taken more than it should. The town had offered polite words and not much more. They had turned their faces elsewhere, because grief made others uncomfortable and because someone needed to keep the business of the town in order. Ruth kept that business in order. She mended shirts with needle and patience. She patched holes in the curtains. She swept dust into a silent line along the threshold and kept moving. That was her strength and the reason they said just the help. Not unkindly, but with the relief of people who can close their hands around a simple truth. She rose early the morning the cowboy arrived, earlier than the usual stirrings. The hutch had been swept, the stove banked down. Her hands smelled faintly of coffee and bread. Outside, the prairie was a sheet of pale gold. The wind carried with it the scent of dry grass and horses. A horse whinnied in the distance, a clean sound that suggested things were about to change. He came in on a gray mare with a white star on her forehead and a saddle that had seen better trails. He did not ride like a man uncaught by the world. He rode like a man who had been held by it and had to let go sometimes. His hat was low, but not so low that you couldn't see the lines at his mouth. Small, well-used, not carved from show. He dismounted with the slow economy of someone who knew when not to rush. The town noticed him as towns always notice a stranger, with the pronged curiosity of a barometer and the readiness of a jury. He did not come to the saloon on purpose at first. He tied his mare to a faded hitching post and took in the place with a steady, unhurried sweep, as if cataloging the cracks and the people that ran the cracks. He was land-rich looking in an odd way, not in fine clothes or gleaming cufflinks but in the set of his shoulders, the secure line of his jaw, as if he carried property behind his eyes. The town whispered that he might be a rancher from 15 miles out, or a drifter with luck. They liked making him into a story they could place on a shelf. Ruth noticed him in the way that one notices weather barely enough to know it will matter. Her hands kept moving. A kettle on the back stove hissed and sang. The saloon door gave that familiar creak and he stood framed in it, rim of morning around him. The room shifted, a small animal inside the house twitching its ears, and then everything resumed as if it had not been interrupted. But she had seen him. Her eyes met his for the briefest second. He looked away first. He had that habit of measuring a gaze and then keeping it in reserve. He ordered coffee, black, and his voice was low in a way that made the room feel narrower and more private. He spoke nothing else. "You new in these parts?" Turner asked, polishing a glass as if polish could fix the world. Just passing through, the cowboy said. There was a texture to the words, like rope, like the smell of saddle leather. He looked at Ruth again as his cup was set before him, and the gesture hung between them. An offering, an invitation, a small check on the world's currency. Ruth set an extra plate by instinct into motion, the old reflex of homemaker and silent kindness. There was a time when that plate would have been for a child or a lover, casually placed with a smile that hid hurt. Now she placed it for strangers with the same motion, as if habit were a prayer. He caught the movement and something like interest stirred. He did not say the thing that the town said, "She's only the help," or the thing the town meant. He only watched her hands, how they folded into the fabric of the day. The town's small cruelties have a way of finding their voices in the open. Mrs. Harlan, who taught sewing in back rooms and sermonized in front rooms, made it her work to make Ruth's silence audible. She would remark on Ruth's dress, too plain, not the latest stitch. She'd remark on how Ruth didn't seem to have a man to keep her, as if pity and indignation were indistinguishable. People nodded with the precise satisfaction of those who believe they've solved a puzzle. She used to be the sort to turn heads, Mrs. Harlan said one day, louder than necessary, as if the saloon were a pulpit. Too proud for her looks, too proud to take her proper place. Set her down in a house with children, and she'd be a different sort entirely. Turner hummed agreement like someone acknowledging a fact on a ledger. Others laughed in the soft way of people who prefer the rustle of another's shame to the creak of their own conscience. Ruth heard them, of course. She had learned how to let their words pass over her like wind and not let them lodge. But words can be small knives, and in the quiet of the night they make patterns under the skin. She walked home with her hands in her apron pocket and her jaw tight. The moon had that raw, hard silver that makes faces look carved. She lay awake more nights than not, and the house around her smelled of dust and old coffee. There were moments, rare, like the sweet spots in a bitter pie, when Elle's voice came back, and she would listen until the world filled again with the reality of being alone. The cowboy watched those nights from the head of his own bedroll at the edge of town. He did not come into her life like a cavalry unit or a plot convenient to novels. He watched. It started small. He left coffee on the stoop some mornings, a tin cup steaming, with only the anonymous scent of warmth to speak for him. He tied Lila, the mare, to Turner's hitch rail and left her there for an hour longer than a man's business called for. He swept snow from the step of the general store with the steady sweep of hands that had done more than reckon figures. He observed with the patience of a man who knew what a single drop of water does to stone. His name, when the town decided it must be spoken, came out like a fact one reads aloud. Silas Cross. Folks tooted. Silas. A name that had the plain, functional ring of a used nail. But names are often coverings. The town had their gossip. That he'd been an outlaw once, maybe that he'd been in wars, that he'd been rich and then spent his fortune. Rumor is the town's religion, and it needs something to believe. Silas did not deny the whispers. He let them hang there, mending the tatter of the town's interest. Sometimes he'd laugh at a story and add one of his own, as if confessions were small currencies to spend on attention. He did not adorn himself. His suit, when he wore one, hung in the way of men who were used to a horse's back more than a cushion. His hands were calloused, broad, ink-stained faintly where a pen had once been gripped. There was guilt in him the way there is guilt in a man who knows he is harder than he wishes to be. It sat in his chest like an old bruise. The turning began, not with speeches, not with dramatic gestures, but with quiet attention. The town's cruelty flared in its usual little rituals. Stares, whispers, the trimming of someone from a sewing circle. One afternoon when Ruth knelt to drag a sack of flour into the storeroom, her knees scraped the rough wood and she swore softly under her breath. An empty chair at the table held the shadow of opinions about her. Mrs. Harlan made a clinical remark about damp hands and a woman's place. The men laughed in the bored way of boys trading a joke. Ruth packed flour into sacks for the week, the same way she had packed her grief. Steady, necessary, careful. She did not answer, but Silas did. He stepped into the doorway with the easy motion of someone passing through whose passage mattered. The room stilled, not only because he had that power but because of what he intended. Everyone knew him enough to expect nothing more than a nod. He gave them more than a nod, he gave them his voice. "She don't need lectures about a woman's place," he said. His voice had the low rumble of a brewing storm. "She needs a good roof and dishes that don't darn themselves." The irony hung between us like a rope bridge and made the town sway. Their heads turned, wondering at the intrusion. Silence pressed. The kettle hissed like an audience clearing throats. Mrs. Harlan's lips thinned. The men shifted in their chairs as if to leave, but also the way someone tightens a fist when surprised by light. Silas' words were a defense, blunt and not entirely polished. He didn't speak of injustice in the way the preacher might, with foaming righteousness. He spoke of the practical things, roof and dishes, that everyone understood. It was enough to make them uncomfortable. He did not say much, not to shame them into confession, but to stake a claim in the room for Ruth's dignity. They turned their attention back to their drinks and their small talk slowly, but the air had changed. Ruth did not smile. She could not. Her face was small and cautious, and part of her resented the thought of being defended like a thing to be saved. She was not a thing. She had folded her own life into small sensible pieces and lived. But when she looked at Silas, the steadiness in him reflected something back she had nearly forgotten. Someone seeing her right there, not as rumor or pity, but as a person worth the bother of speech. Days threaded into one another after that, and the weather took on its correct changes. Wind mellowing into sun into dusky storms that swept over the plain. Silas remained in town longer than he said he would. He fixed a broken hitch rail without announcing the fix. He left extra bags of feed where someone could find them. The town started to whisper again, this time with the flavor of curiosity rather than meanness. They watched them both with the keen eyes that mark two interesting things in the same view. There was an act of kindness that will always be marked by Ruth as the turning point. She found old Jeb by the creek with his foot in a trap. The poor man's face turned to the sky as if to beseech the heavens for what he could not get. Jeb was a deep-rooted thing in that town, a man with a history of laughter and lost-cause charm. He had no money and less tact. When Ruth knelt to loosen the trap, her hands were sure. She fiddled a bit to keep his teeth from chattering with cold. She held her breath. People do this small thing for one another up and down the plains and rarely make poems about it. Ruth didn't expect reward or recognition. She expected only the continuation of life. But when Mrs. Harlan came upon them and saw Ruth with dirt on her hands and Jeb's grateful face, it was like the town found a sports event in which to place bets. Mrs. Harlan's voice rose like a drawn knife. "Ruth May ought to keep better company. You never did watch where you set your feet." The crowd that had assembled made polite noises. Some thought it proper to let shame in their mouths again. Silas was there, studying the breeze like a man who notes the weather before the raining begins. He did not charge the woman or castigate her in a sermonizing voice. He looked at Ruth, his face unreadable for a breath, then folded into something like a smile that was entirely private. "You did good, miss," he said. It was not meant for anyone else's ears. His words were small. They were also enough to change the tide. Mrs. Harlan sputtered, as if to say something sharp, but the sound died in her throat. The crowd shuffled away. The day's drama finished for now, and Ruth kept the comfort of Jeb's thanks close. She didn't need much. She needed to be noticed for what she'd done, not for the imagined shape of her life. Silas kept shaving away at the town's easy cruelty in small ways. A word here, a discreet act of repair there. He didn't parade virtue. He didn't suppose himself grand. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, he chose words that landed like stones placed to mend a wall. Ruth watched, and in watching discovered that there was a man who had seen the seams of the world and who chose, quietly, to mend where he could. Their meetings grew into something that had the slowness of a fawn learning to trust the hand that feeds it. They would sit on the stoop while the sun gave the porch a comfortable, sun-warmed weight. Silas would smooth his hat between his hands and tell stories that were not exactly the kind of stories meant for young ears. They were stories that had the weight of experience and the shape of regret. Ruth listened. Her own speech was measured, less hair-raising than a confession and more like a ledger of truths. She would talk about the pie she meant to make and the way the winter had been cruel when Elle died. She would say, simply, "He taught me to fix a saddle, little details like stitches in a quilt." They held the past against the present. At first, the town's tongue had the habit of assuming all stoicism must be obedience, and all quiet must be meekness. In time, however, the quiet between Ruth and Silas grew to a presence that could not be reduced to a rumor. People watched the two of them and tried to translate what they saw into the language of gossip. It was not that they fell into one another like something scripted. It was that the small, private acts multiplied. Silas bringing her a length of warm blanket when a storm rolled in. Ruth leaving him a pie on his table when he had no one to care for his meals. The world in their gestures was simple and not without fear. Then came the day of the public humiliation, the sort of thing that made the town feel small and large in its cruelty. The fair came into town, a rout of men and women who thought they owed the world color and song. The piazza filled with bright banners and bright talk. Turner rented a booth and sold coffee and a few of his better pies. The saloon was bustling with travelers and locals. The day was warm enough to make people wear their worst faces in the brightness of sun. There was a dance of sorts, and the men who leased more land than they'd seen the rain that summer showed off. Mr. Elliston, a man who owned the feed store and owned the capacity to say cruel things with a smile, saw fit to make an observation about Ruth. "You work hard, Miss May," he said across the competition ring. "All that labor and not a wedding." He pointed the joke at the right angle to make everyone laugh at a single, sharp point. The thing with small towns is that cruelty wants company. Not because it loves company, but because company makes cruelty simple. The crowd gathered like cattle around a feed tub. Ruth's face did not change in expression. She tightened her hands on the dish towel because somewhere the seam of her patience gave. She had been smoothed down and flattened, and it felt like something in her would not be. Largely, she held herself like a flower stem bent against the wind. Silas had been talking to a man about a range dispute when he heard Mr. Elliston. The word wedding dropped like a stone and the sound of the crowd thickened. Silas turned. He moved across the space as if cutting air with his hand. He did not speak first. He didn't need to. His presence did the talking for him, like a good horse answering trouble without a call. He stepped to Ruth's side, his body a simple fact that rearranged the room's geometry. People looked up at his height and the tilt of his hat, and something like a hush settled. "She's had enough labor to buy herself a life, Elliston," Silas said, the name sticking in his mouth like straw. "Don't you go calling her a thing she ain't." Nothing about his words was showy. There was no flourish in them, no attempt at moral fireworks. It was an assertion, brief, functional. Elliston, too accustomed to being the loudest, found himself off balance. Somehow the crowd found it harder to laugh at a woman who stood with a man who spoke for her not from pity but from an acknowledged standing. Ruth did not look at him as if he had rescued her. She looked at him like one looks at steadying porch rail on the first step down to a stoop. She had always been capable of the step. He was a support. That meant more sometimes than someone else performing grand gestures. The humiliation at the fair receded. The town's aimless cruelty found new targets. People always do. But things had shifted. Folks watched Ruth with a new, smaller curiosity that contained within it something warm. They watched Silas watch her. Little kindnesses kept happening. A neighbor who returned a borrowed kettle cleaner than it had been. An old man tipping his hat more properly than before. It was as if once the town had acknowledged the truth, that a person's worth didn't shrink with a story. Then small corrections began to appear. There were nights, of course, when Ruth's stoicism gave way to a quiet sorrow. She would sit by her window and stitch, the needle moving over cloth with the soft monotony of a heartbeat. Sometimes she would think of Elle's laugh and feel a current of wildness in her cheeks. Wildness she didn't show. Silas came sometimes in the aching hours between midnight and dawn, and they would sit together and listen to the wind make its long, living sound. He would tell her little things, confessions less of deeds and more of weather. "I left a man on a road once," he'd say, not to shock but to unburden. "I thought I was being clever, but I left a piece of myself with him." She would listen like someone reading scripture. She needed that kind of listening, the respectful, unhurried kind. The town started to ask about them more bluntly. Some of it came from hope. It was a nicer story to hope two good, solid people might be better together than to watch Ruth drag the world alone. Others cared less about happiness than about what it would mean to be able to gossip. People speculated, would they marry? Would she leave the saloon and take up a small home? Would Silas claim a stake or go riding on to greener valleys? Ruth didn't know how to answer such whispers. Her life had been measured in chores and modest joys. She had not had reason to hold on to dreams. But Silas's presence plants seeds like any gardener's hand. Love for them was not thundered. It came in the hushes, the way silences could lean on one another in the same room. Once in the dim after a heavy rain, Silas took her to the old barn behind the Miller place, and beneath its roof the air smelled of hay and old things. He took off his gloves and simply sat. He looked at her for a long time, and then he pressed a small, careful question across the space between their chests. "You ever think of moving someplace that don't know you for your past?" he asked. There was no demand in it, only the opening of a possibility. Ruth's hands stilled. The question was not the same as, "Will you come away?" It was a compass. "I never asked for much in a new place," she said. "Only to be allowed to cook and warm a bed. That seems a modest life." "It does," he said. "And it suits you if you want it to." He did not demand. He did not bargain. He simply put a map of possibility on the table. In the quiet of that night, she told him a little of what had been buried at Elle's grave. She told him that Elle had had a way of whistling while he worked, a crooked tune that stayed with her like a brand. She told of the last winter and how she tried to keep the house warm enough and the bread soft for the boy. She told him the way grief had been best kept on the inside, a folded thing not to be aired. Silas listened as someone might listen to an old, beloved story, respectful and certain. His face softened in the lamplight, lines pulling back from his mouth like slow curtains. Inevitably, the past found ways to surface that were less polite than the ongoing repair of two people beginning to tether their lives together. Secrets and old reputations cling to the heels like burrs. Silas had a history he couldn't fully hide. People think they know a man, but men cannot entirely free themselves of the places they've been. On a late afternoon when the light came through the saloon windows like honey, a rider arrived, dust flaking from his boots. He said Silas Cross had been that Silas Cross, the one the old men muttered about, the one who had not always chosen the clean path. He'd been in a fight in a town 2 counties over a gun, a name, a history of running. The rider's voice was not the silent kind of accusation. It was loud enough to gather a small crowd into it. The town collected around the story like a swarm. People like to align themselves with narrative simplicity. If Silas had sins, they thought, then perhaps Ruth had been rescued by something less honest than kindness. Mrs. Harlan added a neat moral. Others nodded. A debate formed about whether their new friendship meant more than it seemed. Some asked Ruth if she knew what men like Silas weighed in the balance. "You sure you want to bet on him?" they asked, meaning perhaps not the horse kind of bet. Ruth leaned back against the counter and listened. Her first instinct was to protect him as she would an animal with a limping leg. But she also had her leanings toward a judicious sort. To know someone is to understand their tracks, and no one in her life had ever believed she had the right to defend someone she loved. She thought on the barn night of maps and choices. She thought of the way Silas had stood up for her and of the slow kindness he offered. She walked out into the street with the calm of someone carrying water and put her hand on Silas' arm. He turned, and for a moment they both were children arranging a fort in the dirt. There were people with their eyes turned in like they were the judges. But Ruth held her place with the sort of stubbornness that had kept her upright through namings and losses. "I know what he is," she said simply so the town could hear. "But I'm not afraid of the man he's been. I'm thinking of the work of becoming, not the tally of debts." The words were not a defense of sin nor a plea for a lesser fate. They were an acceptance of a whole person, down to the parts he kept hidden. That afternoon's confrontation ended not with a fight but with the town arguing in a dozen small, fussy ways. Silas' past was not reduced to simple villainy. It had the texture of regret and the small reparation she'd seen. People made their judgments as they always would. The ones who wanted to believe in simpler stories left with their judgments intact. The rest found room to hold both that he had done wrong and that he was trying to make some sop up. That night, they sat together and the barn air felt like the warm cavity of a safe place. Silas told her about the time he left, not to confess but to give shape to the man he was. I rode out when I was heavy with the sort of thinking that thinks itself smarter than it is, he said. I thought I could lash together the ends and make a fortune. I left ruins more than people. He didn't look for absolution. He offered his story like a piece of furniture, part of the house. She touched his hand then, and it was not dramatic. It was not the friction of lovers who touch as a test. It was the solid acknowledgement of two people seeing one another clearly with all that this clarity entails. Flaw, regret, hope. We all leave things, she said. I left a boy in the snow. I can't change that. I can only be here now, and that is what I must do right. Time softened, and a certain pattern of small domestic things began to paint their lives. Silas helped with chores on Sundays, the quiet kind of help that didn't come with announcements. Ruth taught him to fold a pie crust without fuss. He taught her how to break a horse without breaking the creature's spirit. They moved around one another like neighbors who had finally become family. A stray plate on Silas' step, a loaf of bread left on Ruth's doorway. The way their conversation carried the small joys of folk who had not pretended at easy bliss but had found it in the margins. But redemption in small towns rarely comes in acts of notoriety. It comes in steady things, the slow mending of fences and people's perceptions. There was a night when the drought broke and the rain pulled itself across the prairie like an old hand dusting the plains. The ground drank, and the air smelled like the beginning. Turner held a small, private celebration at the saloon, a modest meal, a few words. The town came together in a way that was practical. They needed to trade crops, gossip, and comfort. That night, Mrs. Harlan rose, and instead of her usual sharpness, she cleared her throat and, awkward as a colt, delivered a toast not entirely free of pride. To Miss May, she said, who has kept this town fed when we would have been worse for it. To men who settle down, her words had the cautious ache of someone letting the world change under their feet. People cheered because cheer is more comfortable than silence. Ruth did not like being the center of attention, but she accepted the toast with the grace she had learned in a life that often demanded it. Silas touched her hand under the table, and the small act was enough, quiet as a folded envelope, private as a note. Their lives had not been polished by a show's end. They had been mended by 1,000 small acts of fidelity. The most honest moment came on a porch in the dawn, the same way the tale began. They had taken to sleeping in a small house on the outskirts of town, a place with a porch that caught the sun for first light and a back barn for Silas' tools. The house smelled of dish soap and hay, and the sunlight pooled across the floor like warm money. They were not married officially, not yet, but they had arranged the fabric of the day to include each other. It was in that morning air that Silas spoke the thing that had kept the town's whisper running for months. The clean, foolish, simple confession of a man who has loved plainly. He rose early as usual and stood on the porch with his hat in his hands. The mare grazed by the fence, tail flicking at flies. There was a hush that belonged to the first part of a day, birds not yet satisfied, a distant creak of a wagon. Silas turned his head toward Ruth, who brought down a steaming cup of coffee into his reach. I'd ride 1,000 miles, he said then, not as a line but as a map, if the trail ended with you in my arms. It was an old idiom, and his delivery was not shaped to impress. Yet the plainness of it carried more than the town had expected. Ruth looked at him and saw not a man spun of storms and past mistakes but one who could imagine a long trail worn with the same boots. Her hands shook as she handed him his cup. The movement told him more than a well-turned sentence ever could. She let the words settle over them like new wallpaper, simple and telling. You don't have to ride, she said. We could just stay. He smiled. A small, amazed thing, as if he had been offered a safe harbor and didn't trust it was real. Stay. The word in his mouth was a test. With me. With you, she said, folding the possibility into the shape of the day. Her face eased from its habit of being careful to a softness that had been carefully trained but rarely allowed to flourish. She had feared bright things and now warmed to the idea that she might heat a certain lamp for a man to come home to. They did marry in an understated way over the next spring. Not a great show of finery, but enough meaning in the baking and the small congregation of Turner. A few folks who had come to respect the quiet that keeps things whole, and even Mrs. Harlan, whose composure had been softened by a sorrow for past harshness seen too late. They wed with vows spoken plainly, no great flourishes, only heavy promises like the ones folks make when they mean it. They promised no perfect life, only the truth of honest toil and of presence. Afterward, life settled into the pleasurable, necessary ordinary. The ongoing mending of the fence, the late harvests, the festival where Ruth would bring pies and Silas would stand near the doorway as if to guard a small, bright treasure. They argued sometimes about the right way to tend a horse, or whether to let a cow have its head in winter, but they argued like people building a house, using words as bricks. They held the tenderness of each other's daily habits in their hands, small and sacred. Silas' reputation softened in the town's memory, less a saga of wrongs and more a list that included the small, redeeming works. Helping Mrs. Petty repair her roof, staying up with Jeb through an illness, taking mornings actual and making them matter. People who had once been quick to snub Ruth now dropped by for a cup of coffee and talked about weather as if smoothness were a new virtue. It was not all redemption, not like a sudden salvation. It was more like a slope in a road that had once been steep and gravelly flattening gradually into a passable way. There were challenges, of course. One summer there came a scribbler of a land speculator who wanted to buy out the ridge and change the town into a cluster of estates. He spoke to Silas in the polite language of men who plan to make money off of men and women who have already worn out much. Silas listened and then told the man plain. These hills have a way of teaching a man how to stand with his feet on the ground, he said. I ain't for selling the way of living that's kept people standing in storms. His voice was slow, deliberate. The man left dissatisfied, and the town breathed easier that a person with a steady hand had refused to make a business of their futures. Ruth found a small satisfaction in the years that followed, in the predictable pleasure of a man who knew the sound of her door, a man who left coffee warm on the stoop when he had to ride out. Their house became a kind of refuge. For neighbors with troubles, for the boy who fell off his horse, for the woman who needed bread and didn't have money that week. They were generous in the way people who have had hard things to test their taking no to be, without flamboyant charity, more a slow giving until the store runs out and then the neighbor gives back in some small way. In time, the story of the quiet cowgirl and the buried past cowboy became part of the town's folklore. The tale you tell when a child needs a moral about staying, about forgiveness tempered with hard work. The tale included the moment at dawn when Silas had said he would ride if it meant an ending with her in his arms. People retold it by the saloon stove, wrapped in the smoke of pipes and fondness. But the story's truth lived not in the retelling but in the simple, steady, everyday acts. A pair of hands washing a dish, a warm bed, the way they watched the prairie while the sun slid down in slow satisfaction. Sometimes, on a wind that could carry a man's memory like a scrap of paper, Ruth would stand at the fence and hum Elle's crooked tune under her breath. It was not a confession of forgetting. It was an honoring. She had not erased the past. She had learned to carry it in a pocket with room left over. Silas would come behind her and set his hands on the rails, and together they'd look out over the russet plains that could be cruel and also salvational. Their silhouettes would be simple, like two things finally allowed to grow against one another. Years later, an old man who had been a boy when Ruth and Silas arrived would sit by the saloon stove and tell the story. She gave everything without asking, he'd say, tapping his pipe against the iron. And finally, someone gave back. The younger men around him would grunt and fold the memory into their own lives like a worn hat. It was no grand sermon. It was merely a truth, that steady kindness had the power to change the gravity of a small place. At the end of their days, when the barn lights moved in slower loops and the coffee did not steam with the same urgency, they would sit on the porch with hands linked. Two worn things that had made homes for other people's troubles and met one another. The town had softened enough that kids would run by with no fear of being scorned, and neighbors would drop by with stories about weather and politics and sometimes nothing at all. Ruth's hair went silver in the corners, but her mouth had kept the readiness of small smiles. Silas's back was bowed not from parasols but from work he'd chosen, and his eyes still considered the horizon. Once, in the kind of twilight that makes things confess, Silas turned to Ruth with the steadiness that had always defined him. The crickets made a patient song, the porch boards sighed under their weight, and the mare in the stable made the small contented sounds of an animal who has been well-fed and not hurried. He took her hand in a hand that had long ago learned how to hold another without crushing her. "I promised once," he said, and the voice that had once ridden into town low with secrets was now transparent as a windowpane. "I told the world I'd ride 1,000 miles if the trail ended with you in my arms. I rode a short way mostly, but every step felt worth it because you were at the end." Ruth laughed, small and bright as a bell. "You don't have to have ridden so far," she said. "You only had to come back and keep coming back." "It was easier to return," he said, "when there was someone to come home to." They didn't make speeches. They didn't need to. Their lives had been an accumulation of days that spoke louder than any rhetoric. The town, in all its slow ways, had learned to measure people by the work of their hands and the shape of their kindnesses. The small cruelties had not entirely vanished. People are messy creatures fond of old habits. But the current had changed. The town now held in its communal memory the simple lesson that love and work could reconfigure old stories into new ones. The last winter they passed was soft, quieter than the one that had taken Elle's breath away. In bed they would share the heat and the memory of storms. They would speak less and listen more, and in the pauses there was a comfortable weight, like a well-made blanket folded across knees. Sometimes, when a wind came down from the north and rattled the window panes, Silas would call her name like a prayer. She would answer. In such small exchanges their life was less a story now than an ordinary miracle. Ruth died in the spring, as the first green came up in the garden she'd tended for years. It surprised no one who knew the shape of her life, a woman who had worn her softness like a duty and kept her dignity like a lantern. The town mourned in ways that were real and not theatrical. They came to the house with casseroles and kind hands. They spoke of her truths. They told small stories of her deeds. Silas stood with the others and held a small wooden box at the service. In it were the things she kept of Elle's, a lock of hair, the photograph, the tiny teacup, and something he had left, a short braid of horsehair he'd kept since the day he'd broken Lila to saddle. He pressed the braid into her hands, and she smiled, a private thing, as if to anchor all the years into a single point of light. "Stay," he said to her then, an absurd and humanly simple command, and she said, "Always," which meant everything and nothing the way vows sometimes do, both a comfort and a truth. When they laid her beneath the elm near the small church, the town filed by, taking turns at grief. They told the kind of stories small towns tell, the ones that tie names to memories, the kind that teach children how to be decent. Silas sat on the back of the wagon like a man weathered and not broken. He put his hat in his hands and watched the earth take in a life. He remained as steady as a fence post enduring the seasons. The years will on. Silas kept a room in the house they had shared as a shrine of a comfortable sort. A kettle, a photograph, a chair by a window. He put his head in his hands sometimes and let the tears come, the way rain sometimes falls after a long drought. He would ride once in a while out beyond the fences, feeling the ground roll under him like a memory. People would watch him go and come back, and some would say with a small, satisfied smile, "He kept his word." He rode back. After he passed years later, the town remembered them both as a pair who had been quiet and true. Children learned their names as if they were a lesson in decency. Folks who came from other places told travelers the story by the saloon's dim lamplight, the story of the stubborn, kind woman who kept a town fed and the man who had seen her and stayed. If you were to stand now on that porch where they first learned to speak in the soft dawn light, you would feel the simple fact that people matter in their small acts of keeping. The boards still creak where Ruth once set a dish upon them, and where Silas once stood with a hat in his hands. The town still has its small cruelties. They never entirely go. But there is also a memory of something tender that can and does change lives. A neighbor will help another neighbor there. A pie will be left on a stoop. A horse will be shod true. A quiet woman's name will be used with respect. And a man's past will be weighed with more than a swallow of gossip. She gave everything without asking, and finally someone gave back. He was not an angel, nor did he perform miracles. He rode back because he could not bring himself to stay away, and in coming he remade a small corner of the world. The town learned, imperfectly, the hard tolerance of a life shared in plain, honest actions. If her story hit you hard, if you saw yourself in the stoic hands washing a dish, or the buried past that keeps you from sleeping, then remember this. Some roots grow in silence and some flowers take a very long season to bloom. A word in the right time may change the manners of a town. A steady hand may make a house into a home. If you hold those things, you hold the heart of the tale. And so the fields keep breathing in and out with the seasons. The saloon still has its creak, the kettle still hisses, and somewhere a tin cup catches the sun and sends it warm into a mouth. The little lives in that town keep turning, sometimes cruel, sometimes kind, and in the gentle center of it all was a simple truth, that one person seeing another in their full, ragged, beautiful personhood is more than enough to change the course of many lives. And that's how a whisper changed a town.